Let me set the stage for you. The year is 132 of the Common Era, but nobody knows it because, of course, they weren't counting using that system at that time yet. We didn't start using Common Era and before Common Era or AD and BC for a few centuries still. But from our counting, the year is 132 of the Common Era. The greatest power in the world is the Roman Empire. It had recently hit its peak territorial control, which was around the year 117 CE, from the north of England with a wall built there called Hadrian's Wall. It covered all of Western Europe. It covered all of North Africa. It included the Mediterranean countries of today's Middle East, including as far east at the greatest extent as parts of Mesopotamia and Persia or Iran. It also included the Balkans, Turkey, parts of Central Asia up to Armenia, and the Black Sea. The Mediterranean was truly a Roman lake. As for the land of Judea in 132 CE, it is still smoldering, and the Jewish people are still smoldering from the ruins of the Great Revolt against Rome that had happened just 60 years before, and another revolt among Jewish diaspora communities that took place just 15 years before. That Great Revolt in the year 70, that was around the year 70 of the Common Era, actually ran for 7 full years, from 66 CE to 73 CE. It resulted in mass destruction, including the burning of Jerusalem and the Jerusalem Temple, the destruction of entire Jewish communities, for example, the Qumran community by the Dead Sea, but many others, the selling of thousands of Jews into Roman slavery, and the radical transformation of Jewish life by accelerating trends started before the destruction that are still in Judaism today. Trends like diaspora and synagogues and rabbis. They all existed before the destruction of the temple, but with the loss of the temple, they were what was left to keep Judaism alive. Now, one day, a couple years ago, in the year 130, as part of his tour of the entire Roman Empire, the Emperor Hadrian arrived in Judea. Judea had been under direct military rule by the Roman army since the Great Revolt. In fact, an entire legion was stationed there, attempting to keep the peace. Hadrian came to Jerusalem. He visited the ruins of the Temple Mount. And now there was some disagreement about what was promised there. But soon after his visit, by the year 132 of the Common Era, the word gets around. Jerusalem is to be rebuilt, but this time as a Roman city, renamed Aelia Capitolina. And there is to be a temple built on the Temple Mount, but it is not to be a Jewish temple. It is to be a Roman temple to Jupiter, with statues and sacrifices and libations to the Roman gods. Well, what happened after that? All hell broke loose in Judea. And we still feel the echoes of that clash, that revolt, even today, as we'll see. Now, there was a Jewish holiday marked today. Of course, Jewish holidays begin at sundown and end at sundown. So at sundown today was the end of this holiday. It's a holiday you might not have heard very much about before, or even if you had heard of the holiday, you might not know very much about it to begin with. It's a holiday called Lag BaOmer. Now, Lag actually doesn't mean anything on its own. It's counting. It's like the holiday Tu B'Shvat, which is the 15th of Shvat, but the way you write 15 in Hebrew using Hebrew letters is tu. So the way you write 33 in Hebrew is lag. So it's simply known as the date as it's written, the 33rd of the Omer. But it's not like Tu B'Shvat because Shvat is a month. Tu B'Shvat means the 15th of Shvat. Lag BaOmer means the 15th of the Omer, but Omer is not a Hebrew month. It is, in fact, accounting, and we'll talk about what it is in just a moment. Now, like Tu B'Shvat, Lag BaOmer does not appear in the Torah. If you read the catalog of holidays in Leviticus 23, it's not there. It's a rabbinic invention. What the Torah does describe in Leviticus 23 and elsewhere is that you should count a week of weeks. You should count 7 times 7 weeks. So you have 7 days times 7 weeks. You get 49 days, and the 50th day has a special observance. Now, in the Torah, it says, count from the Shabbat, 7 by 7 weeks. but it doesn't say how to define Shabbat. Does it mean the beginning of Passover, which is like a Shabbat? Does it mean the Shabbat that happens during Passover, because it appears right after Passover in the list of laws? Or does it simply mean from the first time you enter the land after you conquer it, pick a Shabbat and then start counting 50 days? There's even an alternate calendar in Jewish life that existed before the temple was destroyed that was based entirely on these cycles of 7 days times 7 weeks and cycles of 50. It's called the Jubilee calendar. It's a fascinating story in its own right. We'll actually be talking more about Jubilees and counting 7 at our Shabbat in May on the Magic Sevens. In the meantime, it was an early Jewish debate over whether to count from Pesach or from Shabbat. The rabbis settled, we'll count from the first night of Passover, and we'll count these collection of wheat sheaves. It's supposed to be done. That's the Omer, the wheat sheaf. But we need a break. It's too long to go for 50 days with the kind of restrictions we imagine putting in a time like this. Imagine people counting Lent or having days of bad omen or taboos. The rabbis put on a whole series of restrictions on these days of counting the Omer. Many rules of what was to be done and what was not to be done. They called it a time of semi-mourning. No haircuts were allowed during the counting of the Omer, at least the first part of the counting of the Omer. No shaving was allowed. No instrumental music was to be listened to, and certainly no major celebrations, parties, or weddings. To be honest, it sounds a little bit like quarantine times, doesn't it, right? No parties, no gatherings, and no concerts, and no haircuts. We're very familiar with this challenge. Today, it turns into a wedding blackout period that nobody understands. What do you mean you can't marry me at this time? Well, unfortunately, it's during that counting time of the Omer. There's another blackout period around the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, that also many liberal Jews simply don't understand. Now, why did the rabbis define this as a time of mourning? In the Talmud, it describes a plague that began killing the students of Rabbi Akiva, one of the preeminent rabbis, around the time of the Bar Kochba Revolt. It imagined that 24,000 of Rabbi Akiva's students were killed during this period, during this plague, but the plague ended on the 33rd day of counting the Omer. And so that became the day of stopping the mourning, releasing the people from their penitence, and allowing them to celebrate on the day that the plague ended. And you celebrate with parties and bonfires and actually haircuts. There's a tradition that a child at age 3 would get their first haircut on Lag BaOmer. That was a tradition in many communities. Now, this is one of the reasons why the disaster that took place at Mount Meron in Israel was so disastrous this past week. Now, the Lag BaOmer holiday was also connected to a student of Rabbi Akiva's, whom we'll hear about more, whose name was Shimon Bar Yochai. Shimon Bar Yochai is claimed to be the author of the main book of Jewish mysticism called the Zohar. Now, Bar Yochai's grave is supposed to be at Mount Meron. That's where they were going. It was a pilgrimage to the grave of the saint Shimon Bar Yochai, or Rashbi, as he's sometimes known, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, in an acronym. So they were going there because he's the founding figure of this mystical trend, which is dominant in the Hasidic world, which again has large numbers of people. But also you can get the feeling of the release from quarantine, the release from restrictions that might be overwhelming in a normal year when you've had 33 days of no haircuts and no music and no parties and no weddings. But this is the first Lag BaOmer after all the COVID quarantines and all the challenges which affected even communities that tried to reject it were still constrained in many ways by the limitations put on by this disease. And so it was a release in many ways. And unfortunately, it led to great overcrowding and people not following guidelines of distancing and space, which doesn't happen under normal circumstances in Israel anyways. And so it ended in tragedy when there were people that fell and trampling took place. And of course, this is not unique to Jews. There have been mass trampling events at music concerts. There's been mass trampling events at a pilgrimage in Mecca for Muslims doing the Hajj. So we've seen it there as well. Alas, unfortunately, now Lag BaOmer has a mourning side to it as well as a celebratory side of release. The end of one plague, but the striking of death to many others. At this point, the count I read was 45 dead. That could be going up from those in intensive care. I will note, by the way, that observing the 33rd or Lag BaOmer as the day of festival is not universal. They all agree that Lag BaOmer is the date it ended, but many Sephardic Jews wait and celebrate the release date on the 34th. And they release all the restrictions starting the day after Lag BaOmer, as opposed to immediately on the day. But that's a diversity of Jewish life. We're always willing to and happy to celebrate that. But the dominant trend is to end it on the 33rd and make that the festival. Now, how does this connect to the Bar Kochba Revolt? I already alluded to the fact that Akiva and his students are part of this process. But it turns out that Bar Kochba's name was not originally Bar Kochba. We now know from letters that he wrote, which we have found, that his name was originally Shimon Bar Kochba, but he was called Bar Kochba for a particular reason. Bar Kochba in Aramaic means son of a star. He was called son of a star by none other than Rabbi Akiva himself. He was a giant of rabbinic teaching and literature in that generation. You can't read the Mishnah or the Talmud and not be struck by the number of times Rabbi Akiva is cited as an authoritative source. And yet, why did he call Bar Kochba the son of a star? Because Akiva was convinced that Bar Kochba was indeed the Messiah. The Messiah that would come to reestablish the kingdom of David, to reestablish Jewish independence. And of course, he was wrong. Spoiler alert, the Bar Kochba Revolt was also an unmitigated disaster. There were brief victories, and there was a period of Judean independence, which included minting new coins with stars as a motif for Bar Kochba, or in the year of Jewish liberation or the liberation of the temple. But gradually it was a defeat because the might of the Roman army and the Roman Empire was not to be denied. In the end, there were thousands killed, including many civilians whose settlements were simply wiped out by the Roman army because they were sick of dealing with these pesky Jews. And there were thousands more who were enslaved, both fighters and civilians. In the end, the core territory of Judea around Judah and in the Judean desert was depopulated of Jews. And eventually, the city was built in the old site of Jerusalem. It was called Aelia Capitolina, and there was a temple built dedicated to Jupiter on that mount. And Jews were forbidden to enter the city of Jerusalem except for one day a year. And that was the day of Tisha B'Av, to commemorate the Roman burning of that temple. It was the only day they were allowed into their holiest city. And in the end, to add final insult to all these injuries, the Romans decreed that the province would receive a new name. Instead of separate provinces of Samaria and Judea and the Galilee, it would now be united under the name of an ancient Israelite enemy. And the territory was called Syria Palestina, after the Philistines. In other words, this is the birth of the name Palestine. Now today, you can still visit some of the sites attributed to the Bar Kochba Revolt. We found caves that these soldiers dug and hid in, and storage rooms underground that you can visit. Now, you have to be in decent shape, and it helps to be, the size of a college student to squeeze through these tunnels, because it really is amazing how compressed the space is. And even when you're in these storage rooms, they are 4 feet high or so. You have to be crouched over the whole time. And to imagine people lived and fought and hid in these caves for periods of weeks and months was really unbelievable. You can feel how desperate the fighters were to submit to that, to put themselves through that, rather than surrender. It may well be that when the Talmud says Akiva's students were killed, they were killed by Romans rather than killed by the plague. And this student, Shimon Bar Yochai, supposedly hid from Roman persecution during and immediately after the Bar Kochba Revolt. He hid in a cave for years, during which he had many of his mystical insight visions that became the basis for the Zohar. Now, the truth is, of course, that's an attribution. Shimon Bar Yochai didn't actually write the Zohar. It was most likely compiled and written as a complete volume about 1,000 years later by someone living in Spain, in medieval Spain. So it's a much later production attributed back to Bar Yochai, but the legends are still there. And there's a reason why people still go to his grave and still pray for his intervention all year long, not just on Lag BaOmer. So with a disaster like this that led to the fragmentation of rabbinic life, the destruction of many rabbis, including some of the most preeminent rabbis being martyred by the Romans, including, by the way, Rabbi Akiva, who was flayed alive, had all of his skin taken off. What is the legacy of a disaster so total and undermanning as this? Well, it turns out it's quite a bit, and it's more than just the name Palestine. First of all, the Bar Kochba Revolt marked a full and final break with the early Jewish Christians. Both Jews and Christians were following dietary laws by and large, were reading the same Old Testament / Hebrew Bible scriptures, although the Christians had begun to do so more in Greek than in Hebrew. But by claiming that Bar Kochba was the Messiah, when the Christians had their own Messiah that they were still hoping to follow, that marked an irrevocable break between the communities. And one of the later Gospels, the Gospel of John, is written around the same time period, maybe a little bit before the Bar Kochba Revolt. And John is the one that's furthest away from the Judean roots of the Jewish Christian movement, where it refers to Jesus talking to the Jews as if they're a totally different population, which you don't see in the earliest Gospel of Mark, as an example. A second consequence we're still dealing with today is a dominant strain of rabbinic anti-messianism and anti-militarism, at least until the 20th century and the founding of the modern state of Israel. But by and large, over the centuries, rabbis were very, very skeptical of claims of messianic deliverance or that the Messiah was here, in part because they had been so burned by the Bar Kochba Revolt and by Akiva's enthusiastic support for Bar Kochba. They said, for example, if you're planting a tree and someone claims to have seen the Messiah coming, you should finish planting the tree and then go see about the Messiah, because you might kill the tree by looking after the Messiah, and who knows, he might not be the Messiah. And there are other examples of letters to Maimonides where people are saying, times are so terrible now, shouldn't the Messiah be coming? And Maimonides says, Messiahs are few and far between. When the Messiah comes, you won't be asking questions. You'll know. And just like their anti-messianism, the rabbis are also generally anti-militarist. They don't support military revolts and interventions in history. That lesson was learned the hard way after these multiple revolts. So they de-emphasized the militarism of the Maccabees. They even de-emphasized the military disaster of Bar Kochba, because you read a little bit about Bar Kochba in the traditional sources, but you don't read as much about the enthusiasm of Rabbi Akiva. You hear a lot more about Akiva's rabbinic teachings than his messianism. And even more importantly, you see how they de-emphasize the rabbis, if you know about the stories of Hanukkah and how it was de-emphasized in early rabbinic teachings. And when it finally appears, it's the miracle of the lights that's important, not the military victory of the Maccabees. That just reflects this de-emphasis of militarism and a desire for postponing the messianic and militaristic delivery promises until post-Messiah, and not causing the Messiah to come by any kind of action now. And rebuilding the temple was a major part of traditional Jewish belief before the Bar Kochba Revolt, and remained part of Jewish liturgy, but again, it was postponed until a long time from now. It was nothing they imagined that would be imminent. They had to work on the replacements. The transition to the synagogue and away from the temple is accelerated beyond that imagined messianic future. It isn't until the late 20th century you begin to get fringe groups imagining perhaps blowing up the temple in Jerusalem that's there now, which is called the Dome of the Rock, and replacing it with a new third temple. And radicals actually plotted to do this in the mid-1980s. Fortunately, they were stopped, because you can imagine the conflagration that would have taken place if something like that had happened. In fact, the rabbis went so far to de-emphasize militarism and Bar Kochba is they don't call him Bar Kochba in the Talmud. They call him Bar Kochba, which means the son of a lie. Well, that tells you what they thought. In the 20th century, the story of Bar Kochba found new life because it became an inspiration and a source of imagery for a renewed Jewish militarism. We know about left-wing Jewish youth movements like Hashomer Hatzair and other groups like that, but you also had a right-wing Jewish youth movement for right-wing Zionist policies and politics. They called themselves Beitar. Beitar was the stronghold of Bar Kochba that held out until the very last. It was the Masada equivalent for the Bar Kochba Revolt. Masada was in the first Great Revolt. Beitar was with Bar Kochba in the second. And this is even continued into the modern state period because you get sports teams that are named after Maccabi, like Maccabi Tel Aviv, but you also get sport teams named after Beitar. And unfortunately, you get right-wing politicians and right-wing supporters who support right-wing sports teams. And this unfortunately happens in European soccer as well as Israeli soccer. We also find a common human phenomenon reflected in Bar Kochba that continues into our own day, and that is the attraction of the mystical and the radical after you've been suffering. You know, Shimon Bar Yochai and his mystically inclined journey happens after and during these persecutions that come as a result of the Bar Kochba rebellion. And the actual creation of the real Zohar took place in the 12th century amid the stress of both a fundamentalist Muslim invasion of Spain by North African Berbers called the Almohads, and the Crusaders from Western Europe going into the land of Israel and killing Jews both in Europe and in the land of Israel proper along the way. Similarly, 400 years later, after the Zohar had been written, there was a renaissance of Kabbalah in the aftermath of the Spanish expulsion in 1492. Many of those Spanish exiles found their way to Sfat in the north of Spain, and it became a hotbed of Jewish mystical thought, in large part because of the response to that crisis. And so that's one of the reasons why this grave site on Mount Meron, the supposed grave site of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, has become an important location of pilgrimage. As one example, Moroccan Jews had a tradition of doing pilgrimage to their ancestral holy men's sites in Morocco. But since they left Morocco in the 1960s, they haven't been able to return. We'll see if borders reopen with the recent peace accords that have been made between Morocco and Israel. So they might be able to return to those pilgrimages, but this became a kind of substitute pilgrimage location for all those holy site pilgrimages they were no longer able to go to. And some Ashkenazi Jews think, holy site pilgrimages, what are you talking about? That seems very unusual, very paganish. And then you remember that lots of Ashkenazi Hasidic Jews go to visit the grave of the Baal Shem Tov in Ukraine, and that becomes a kind of bacchanalia for them too, as a release event. So this was a pilgrimage location for many, many years, but it becomes even more important after the crisis and constriction of the COVID era, and it becomes a time of freedom and release, and unfortunately, releasing the hordes as well. I'll also point out, by the way, that this site is a particular shrine for women to go for pilgrimage, both for healing from illness, but also if they are barren and unable to become pregnant. The story is that you're supposed to lie down on the grave of Shimon Bar Yochai, and when you get up, you'll be pregnant. Now, how that happens mechanically, you and I can speculate, but that's one of those theories. In any case, the attraction of the mystical after disaster is still part of our life. One of the most exciting parts about the Bar Kochba story is that we've learned more about it just in the last couple generations. An amazing trove was found in the Dead Sea desert in the mid-1950s and further excavated in the early 1960s, where they found some hidden compartments in those caves. It's called the Cave of Letters. You can read more about it. Some of the excavations were done by Yigal Yadin, who was a former general in the pre-Israeli army called the Palmach, and then got into archaeology. And what we found in that trove were letters from generals to Bar Kochba. That's how we know what his real original name was, Bar Kochba. And we have, I think, at least one example of his handwriting on some of this material as well. We have examples of the coins from the Bar Kochba Revolt period, including those inscriptions of the liberation of Jerusalem. And we even find examples of Roman coins that had the gods' images scraped off of them. But we can detect what was there. And yet, you know, the Jews were using them because they didn't want the gods' images or the Roman emperor's image on there. They defaced them to make them no longer have those idolatrous images. And my favorite discovery that was found there is a whole sheaf of legal documents relating to a property dispute involving a woman landowner named Babata. What's fascinating is you have, in this era, a woman who is the legal landowner and is debating with people over what the boundaries of her territory are and what proper usage is. And we have sort of the legal lawyer exchange of letters material from that. And it reveals all kinds of fascinating information about everyday life that we don't necessarily get from the official rabbinic documents or Roman imperial accounts of the day. We also still have today something that began back then. And that is, once the Jews had lost the Bar Kochba Revolt, the messianic image and vision had been crushed, and they had been forcibly expelled from the land. Now they began to long for their homeland with the distance of diaspora and a vision of expulsion, where they belonged in the land. They would have been there if not for expulsion. And now that land is gone and they can't get there, and it might well be perfect, but they can't get there because of these circumstances beyond their control. Now, before the Great Revolt in 66 BC, 66 CE, and before the Bar Kochba Revolt, which led to the depopulation of the land by Jews, Jews had left the land before. There were millions of Jews living in the Greco-Roman diaspora, particularly in Alexandria and Egypt. There were tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of Jews living in the East, in what was formerly the capital of the Babylonian Empire. They had chosen to stay there after the exile. When the elites returned, some of them, ordinary people, stayed. So there were Jews living by choice outside of the land. And if you think of yourself leaving your land by migration as opposed to being expelled, it's a very different dynamic of homeland and where you're choosing to live. But if you feel you were expelled and you belong there and you wish you could come back and you imagine everything possible could happen in that land that would be perfect, then you have a very idealized vision of what that land will become instead of the messy reality that takes place. And so you'll go to a pilgrimage with tens of thousands of people at the tail end of a pandemic and not enough crowd control and not enough room for all the people. But we are in the perfect land. We are in the Holy Land. What could go wrong? We've been promised this for centuries. And the same thing for all the other messy realities of the state of Israel, or for other peoples who are in exile, imagining the messy reality of returning. It's harder than imagining the perfect return to exactly what they wanted from the beginning of time or the beginning of their identity. And finally, I think in many ways, the Bar Kochba Revolt presents an object lesson in improving the human condition. Is it through radical, miraculous change delivered from outside? Or are there dangers in expecting a savior to upend the laws of history and the universe? Was Judea ever really going to defeat Rome, the greatest empire in the world? And would Rome just let them go and say, it's not worth it anymore. Go ahead, be free. No way either one of those things was going to happen. Now, we do not have to settle for reality, but we do have to base our hopes of where we want to go and where we find ourselves now in real life. Perhaps it's safer to go cautiously in small numbers to start, and then the masses will follow when the stage is ready. But that's the stage for our action as of today. Well, I want to stop at this point and ask if you have any comments, questions, or reactions to either events that happened in Israel, the concept of Lag BaOmer, or the legacy of the Bar Kochba Revolt.
I have to say that there is no more beautiful sight than to be on the Haifa Road, at least back in the 70s, and see bonfire after bonfire after bonfire on the beaches. It's really something. I don't know if they still do that, but secular Jews would go out and light these bonfires, and they were incredible.
Yeah, one of the complications of the crowd event was that they had not only thousands of people, but also bonfires going all over the place, and that just made it that much harder to manage. Well, I hope you learned something about the background of the holiday Lag BaOmer or the story of Bar Kochba. If you do go to Israel at some time in the future, and you have the time to take one of these Bar Kochba tours that are run, it really is a fascinating experience. Now, I mean, I went on this tour when I was, 19. I was able to crawl into those caves and see what happened. Maybe there are virtual tours you could do these days. I didn't take the time to look, but if you search around on the internet, you might find someone doing it with a GoPro camera and crawling through so you get a sense of what the caves look like. But it really is a fascinating experience to think of what these people were like, how deeply they believed in their cause, even if it's hopeless. And, maybe this is one of the messages we'll end with. There's a marvelous short story by the Yiddish writer Yud Lamed Peretz. It's called Drei Matones, or Three Gifts. And it imagines stories of martyrdom from Jewish history. But at the end of the story, the narrator says, these stories are basically worthless, absolutely beautiful, but totally worthless. And in many ways, it's articulating the challenge of a secular Jew appreciating the stories of Jewish martyrdom for religious causes. Because on one level, they died for something we don't think is true. On the other level, they died for what they believe to be true and what they believe to be the core of their Jewishness. And so in one way it's beautiful, in one way it's worthless, and in all ways it's our story. And so we get to tell it in our own way.